you so much for joining us today. Today I will be presenting my continuous school improvement plan for focus on Algebra 1 performance data at a high school. My name is Jesse Garcia, and thank you so much for joining us. What's more, this project is running in multiple years of data, specifically from 2021 through 2025, and it uses data to identify patterns in student performance over time. Now, before I go any further, I want you to think about something for a moment. Think about your own classroom or content area. Have you ever noticed that students can do the work, but when you ask them to explain it, they struggle? That's really the core issue this project is addressing. This presentation is not just about the numbers or the test scores, it's about understanding how students are learning, and more importantly, where the learning is breaking down. As we move through this presentation, I'm going to walk you through the data, the problem, and the plan. Not just what needs to change, but how we can actually implement those changes in a real school setting. So the purpose of this study is to go beyond the surface level data and really analyze what's happening with student performance in Algebra 1. First, I looked at the data. I looked at the performance trends over the 4-year period, not just 1 year, because 1 year can be very misleading. What I really am looking for is going to be patterns. Second, I'll focus on identifying the gaps, specifically between approaches, meets, and master's levels. Now here's something important to understand. Approaches mean students can follow the steps. Meets and masters mean students can actually understand what they're doing. And that is a huge difference. From there, we work to determine what is the root cause. Not just what the problem is, but why. From there, we work to determine the root causes. Not just what the problem is, but why it exists. Because if we don't understand why, any solution that we create is just temporary. Finally, I develop strategies and implementing a plan. I want to emphasize this. This is not just theoretical. Everything in this plan is designed to be practical and actually used on campus. Let's start off with a school profile. Before we begin to analyze the data, we need to understand the context of the school. So, Donna High School serves a diverse population of students in the Rio Grande Valley. And a large percentage of the students are economically disadvantaged, which can cause an impact on both their resources inside and outside of school. We also have a significant population of English learners. Now think about what it means, for example, in a math classroom. Students are not just learning math, they're also learning the language of math at the same time. And that adds an extra layer of complexity to the instruction. And in addition to that, there are students receiving special education services, which means that differentiation, as I talked about it right before, is not just optional, it's also very necessary. Now, at the same time, this campus is a CCMR campus. What that means is that we are focused on college, career, and military readiness. So the expectation is not just the expectation is not just basic understanding. It's preparing students for life after high school. And that's where the tension comes in. We have high expectations, but the data shows that students are not necessarily consistently reaching those higher levels. So let's go ahead and go over our data sources, where we gather our data. To make sure that the analysis was accurate and meaningful, I used multiple sources of data. The primary source of data was the Texas Academic Performance Reports, or TAPER. Now, this report gives us a very clear understanding on how the campus is performing overall, but TAPER is not enough. I also looked at the STAR Algebra results, specifically from 2021 through 2025. Now, this allowed me to go ahead and break down the performance into 3 levels: approaches, meets, and masters. And that distinction is very critical because each level represents a different depth of understanding. In addition, I reviewed the campus improvement plan. This tells us what the school intends to do long term. But there's an important question to that. Does the plan that we have match what we see in the data? And then finally, consider classroom data and perception data. Student learning data collectively using formative assessments, student work samples, teacher perceptions, and student perceptions. We need to understand what the teachers are seeing, what the students are experiencing, and how instruction is actually happening. Yeah. When we combine all of this, you get a much deeper clearer picture of what's really going on. So let's start off with the Algebra 1 performance overview from years 2021 through 2025. As you can see, at first glance, the data looks pretty stable. The percentage of students performing in the approaches level stays between 76% to 81%. So if you just looked at the number, you might say, okay, we're doing fine. But this is why we have to look a little bit deeper. When we look at the other two indicators, our meets and our masters, we see a completely different picture. Those numbers are much more lower, and although there's some growth, there's not a lot. So what does this tell us from approaches, meets, and masters? Well, it tells us that students are able to reach a basic proficiency, but they're not consistently moving beyond that. Think about it this way. A student can follow all the steps to solve an equation, but if you change the problem slightly or ask them to explain why it works, that's where the struggle begins. That's where we're seeing that this data is a kind of learning ceiling. Students hit a point where they stop progressing, and that ceiling is what we need to break through. So let's go into our key findings. What are our key findings? From the data, there are several key findings that stand out. First, most of the students are meeting expectations, minimum expectations. That's going to be our approaches level. But very few are exceeding those expectations. So this is where we go into our drop-off. There's a significant drop-off between approaches and meets levels. That's not just a small drop-off, it is a gap, actually. Third, there is limited evidence of higher order thinking, which is very important. Let me explain it to you. Because higher order thinking is what drives students into meets and masters. Without it, students stay stuck at basic levels. Fourth, is going to be patterns that have remained consistent over multiple years. And that tells us something critical. This is not just a one-year issue. This is not a group of students issue. This is a system issue. And when it's something systematic, it means that we have to look at the instruction, not just the students. Now let me make this more concrete. Think about students working through a linear question. They can follow the steps like move the variables, simplify, divide, or get the answer. But the moment that you ask, why did you divide there? Or what does it actually represent? That's where the struggle starts. And that's the difference between approaches and meets. Going back into approaches, what it means is I can do it if it looks familiar. If it looks like something I've done before, it is easy. But when you go into meets or masters, it's actually, I understand it well enough to explain it or apply it differently. So that's what we're seeing in data. It's not just a performance gap, it's a thinking gap. That we address how students think, not just what they do. This pattern is going to continue, and it will stop us from receiving those numbers that we saw in the previous slides, or not just meeting but exceeding the numbers where we're changing our approaches to meets and we're moving meets to masters. Let's look at the problem.
Well, we had to.
So when we define the problem, it becomes very clear. Students can perform procedures, they can follow steps, they can complete familiar tasks, but when we ask them to explain their thinking, that's where the breakdown happens. That's where they struggle with conceptual understanding. They also struggle to apply their knowledge in new situations. So it's not that they don't know anything, it's that their understanding is not deep enough. We also see inconsistent progress over time. When there are gains, they're not sustained. And then we consider equity, English learners, for example, and SPED students, they face additional barriers. So the problem is not just academic, it's also systematic. And that's why the solution has to be address the system, not just the students. So let's go into our root causes.
Yeah.
When we look at the root causes, there's not just one issue. It's a combination of factors working together. First, we're going to have that instructional design may not be focusing too heavily on procedure. Students are learning instructional. First, instructional design may be focusing too heavily on procedures. Students are learning how to do the steps, but not necessarily why those steps work. Second, there may be a misalignment between instruction and assessment. If a classroom tasks are simple, but the start requires deeper thinking, students are not being prepared for that level. Third, differentiation may not be consistently supporting all learners, especially for EL or SPED students. Access to rigorous content is critical. And then finally, there might be inconsistency across classrooms. Different teachers, different approaches, different expectations. And when instruction is inconsistent, student outcomes are inconsistent. So again, this is not just about one teacher or one group. This is a system as a whole. Let me connect this to what actually looks like in a classroom. Imagine that you have two classrooms teaching the same standard. In one classroom, students are practicing problems over and over again. Step, step, answer. And in another classroom, students are being asked, explain your reasoning. And so when you compare the two methods, what would happen if both classrooms are teaching the same text, but the level of thinking is completely different? And over time, the differences show up in the data. Now, let's add another layer to this. If instruction isn't consistent across all classrooms, the students are getting different experiences depending on the teacher they have. So this is just a problem about curriculum. It's a problem about how curriculum is being delivered every day and in every classroom. Now, there's also something else that we need to consider. Students adapt to the level of thinking we constantly ask from them. If classroom tasks are procedural, then students become very good at following procedures. But when a student is finally asked to explain, justify, or apply, it feels unfamiliar. So in many cases, it's not just that students cannot think at a higher level, it's that they have been constantly asked to. That's just responsibility back to the instruction, because rigor isn't about difficulty. It's about the type of thinking we normalize every day. So let's go into our guiding questions. We have a total of 5 questions. So we're going to move from one problem to solution using our guiding questions. These questions will help structure our thinking and keep us focused. So the very first thing we're going to ask, where are we now? That's what we're talking about. That's our data that we just analyze. So we already have that answered. Second, where do we want to be? Which is what we've been talking about, that we need to transition our students from approaches into levels of masters, or levels of meet, and then changing our meet students to mastery. Third is going to be how do we get here, which is going to be a root cause analysis. It'll explain why we have the scores right now and what is the necessary steps that we need to take to improve that, which will lead to the fourth question, how will we improve? And this is where we actually have to strategically think about what is it that we're going to do to fix this issue or improve it. And finally, how will we know it's working? So we have all these things that we're going to plan out, and in the end, how do we know if it's actually causing a change? And so if we don't measure progress, we don't know if our strategies are effective. So these guiding questions, they will help with every decision that will improve the process. Now, I want you to pause here for a moment, because these questions are not just part of the presentation. This is actually a framework that can be used in any classroom or campus. Now let's walk through what this looks like in practice. When we ask, where are we now? We're not just guessing. We're actually using data, student performance, classroom evidence, trends over time. Then when we ask, where do we want to be? This is important, because if we're not clear on the goal, then improvement becomes very vague. In this case, the goal is very specific. We need to move students from approaches into meet and masters. And now this is where it gets a little bit deeper. How do we get there? This is where a lot of schools stop too early. It's easy to say students are struggling, but it doesn't explain everything. We need to ask, is it instruction? Is it alignment? Is it access to rigor? So without asking those questions, we don't have understanding, because we can't identify the cause. We cannot design the right solution. So we need to concentrate on those questions, and then we need to move to how will we improve. This is where the strategy comes in. This is where everything that we talked about, instructional rigor, differentiation, the data usage, is actually gets implemented. And finally, after we create a plan and we implement the plan, we need to see if it's working. Now, this might be the most important question of all, because if we're not monitoring product consistently, we risk continuing having the same results over and again, where we're stagnant because we don't know if what we're doing is effective. So these guiding questions are not just theoretical; they drive every decision in this improvement plan, and more importantly, they keep focus on continuous improvement, not just one-time change. So going on to 10, data, data needed to drive decisions. To fully understand the problem, we need more than just test scores. We need four types of data. Demographic data tells us who our students are. Student learning data tells us how they're performing. Perception data tells us how instruction is experienced. And school process data is how instruction is being delivered. Now, let me give you an example. A student might struggle on a test. That's the learning data. And so the perception data might show that they're disengaged. And then the process data might show that the instruction is not aligned to rigor. Now, when you put all that together, you start to understand the full picture. So that allows us to make us do better decisions. So let me show you how this actually connects in practice. Let's say we notice a group of students performing on a low and informative assessment. That's student learning data. Now we ask, who are the students? That would be demographic data. Then we look at perception data. Are they engaged? Do they feel confident? And then finally, we look at process data. What kind of instruction are they receiving? So now, instead of saying that the students are struggling, we can say something a little bit more specific. These students are struggling, and here's why. And that completely is a different level of understanding. That's what allows us to respond with intention instead of guessing. So we need to develop an early warning system. So an early warning system is going to be about being proactive instead of reactive, meaning that instead of waiting for something to happen and us reacting to it, we are anticipating something happening and we're doing the necessary changes in order for us to stop it from occurring. So instead of waiting, for example, students to fail, we identify them early and intervene. And so we have a couple of the formative monitoring, attendance engagement, data meetings, and targeted interventions. Let me go through them. So this system uses multiple indicators, as I mentioned: formative assessments, attendance, and engagement. For example, if a student consistently missing assignments or not participating, that is a warning sign. And so through the regular use of data meetings, teachers can review this information and respond quickly. This might include small groups instructions, reteaching, or additional support. The key is consistency. This is not something that we do once. This is something that we do continuously. Now let's take this a step further, because an early warning system is only effective if it actually leads to action. So it's not just about identifying students, it's about responding to what we see. Let's think about how this looks in practice. Now, a teacher might notice through a formative assessment that a group of students are consistently struggling with specific content. That is your first signal. So we then look at the indicators: attendance, participation, assignment completion. Those are things that we have to look for at the student. When multiple indicators start to align, that's when we know that intervention is needed. But here's where it becomes important or becomes powerful, because this information is not just kept in isolation. It's brought into the data meetings, which is important to have, because we need to not just gather the data, but we need to look at the data. And in those meetings, teachers are not just reporting data, they're analyzing it together. This is where they ask, what are we seeing? Why is this happening? And what are we going to do next? And then this leads to immediate instructional decisions. For example, do we do small group instruction? Do we do targeted reteaching? Or do we adjust question strategies? Now, from a leadership perspective, this also seems to create accountability, because it's no longer, well, we see how they do this on a test. It becomes we are monitoring progress continuously. And that shift is critical, because instead of reacting at the end, we're intervening through the process. And over time, that consistently is what leads to improvement. Not just one strategy, not just one intervention, but a system that's used consistently across classrooms. And as I mentioned before, consistently in one classroom, consistently across all classrooms. So going to slide 12, the improvement plan. The goal of the improvement plan is simple: increase the number of students reaching meets and masters. But the approach is structured. We're going to focus on 4 key areas. The very first one is going to be instructional rigor, then curriculum alignment, data-driven instruction, and finally, differentiation for all students. Let me explain. Um, each of these plays a role. If we increase rigor, without support, students struggle. If we use data but don't adjust instruction, nothing happens. If we differentiate without rigor, students stay at basic levels. So all four must work together. It is a system. Now let's make this practical for a moment. How does increasing rigor actually look like? Does it mean make things harder? Does it mean changing the type of thinking we ask our students to do? So let's go ahead and I'll give you some tips. Instead of asking solve this equation, we ask explain why this method works. Create your own problem. Compare different approaches. Now pair that with differentiation. Some students may need sentence stems, visuals, or guided support. Others may be ready for the additional or the extensions task. And then the data that use ties it all together, because if we're not consistently checking where students are and we can't adjust instruction in real time, then this plan is not about doing more. It's about teaching differently and intentionally. So let's go ahead and look at key strategies. To support the plan, we're going to use higher order questioning, text alignment at rigor, frequent formative assessments, and targeted EL and SPED support. So going to higher order questioning, that pushes students to think deeper. So for example, instead of asking what is the answer or why does this work, text alignment ensures the instruction matches expectations. Frequent formative assessments allow us to adjust instructions in real time, and targeted support ensures that all students have access to learning, and the strategies are simple but powerful when used consistently. So let's look at the implementation plan, where we have rigorous instruction, professional development, leadership alignment, and monitoring and feedback. Implementation plan, this is where everything comes together, where we have rigorous instruction, professional development, leadership alignment, monitoring, and feedback. Leadership sets expectations, teaches implement instructions, professional development supports growth, monitoring ensures accountability. And one of the things we're missing, the system breaks down. Let me go a little bit further. Implementation is not just about doing more. It's about doing things more consistently and effectively. That's what leads to a sustainable improvement. Let me break it down a little bit further. From a leadership perspective, administrators are responsible for setting clear expectations, providing professional development, and monitoring instruction. But teachers are the ones that bring life into the classroom. They're the ones that adjust instruction, use data, and respond to students' needs daily. And this is where the implementation often breaks down. Not because people don't care, not because there's lack of consistency. So the goal here is alignment. Everyone from leadership to teachers working together for the same focus. Because if one part of the system is off, the entire plan loses effectiveness. So let me make this a little bit more concrete. Imagine a campus where the plan is fully implemented. You walk into an Algebra 1 classroom, you will see students explaining their thinking, they're working collaboratively, and teachers are asking higher order questions consistently. And most importantly, you would also see consistency across every single classroom. Because one of the biggest challenges in school is variability. Students shouldn't get a completely different level of rigor depending on the teacher they have. So implementation is really about reducing the variability. It's about making sure that every student in every classroom has the same level of high quality instruction. So, our timeline. Let's walk through what actually this looks like over time. Before students even begin, the focus is on preparation. This includes aligning curriculum, planning instruction, and setting clear expectations. This is right before the school year starts. At the beginning of the school year, we set expectations and routines. Students understand what is expected, teachers begin to implement strategies consistently. And as we're going through the year, um, we monitor students. This is where monitoring becomes critical. We're not just waiting until the end of the year to see results. We're constantly asking our students approving what needs to change right now, and year becomes a checkpoint. This is where the evaluation process makes adjustment. Um, Not just small adjustments, meaningful ones based on data. And then during professional development times, we reflect, we ask, what worked, what didn't, what do we need to refine?
What?
Because continuous improvement is not just a one-time effort, it's an ongoing cycle. This timeline ensures that the work doesn't stop, it evolves. And let me add one more thing to this piece. This timeline is not meant to be rigid, it's meant to be responsive because we monitor data throughout the year. We may need to adjust pacing, strategies, or focus areas. For example, if we see that students are still struggling with conceptual understanding mid-year, we don't wait until the next school year to fix it. We respond immediately. This might mean reteaching or adjusting instructional strategies or providing target support. And that flexibility is critical because continuous improvement is not just about following a plan perfectly, it's about responding to what students need in real time. All right, we reached this far already. So in conclusion, Data High School has the data, direction, and determination to move students beyond minimum proficiency. The data clearly shows the gap between basic proficiency and mastery. To close the gap, we must shift from procedural teaching to conceptual learning. The data must guide instruction and not just measure it. And collaboration is essential. Ultimately, the goal is to ensure that all students have opportunity to succeed at high levels, not just pass, but truly understand what they're applying and what they're learning. And that's what continuous school improvement is really about. And I'll leave you with this thought. If a student can complete the work but cannot explain it, then we haven't fully taught it yet. And that's the shift that this plan is designed to make. Thank you again for your time. And before we leave, I wanted to go over the presentation, the references. Let me go ahead and go to the next slide. Now, this presentation was running in established research and state frameworks to support continuous school improvement. Key sources include Bernhardt's work to data analysis, which emphasizes the importance of using multiple data sources to guide decision making. Bamberg Sotomayor's Driven by Data framework was also used to structure how data can be translated into instruction action. Additionally, Love and colleagues highlight the role of collaborative inquiry in improving teaching and learning. At the state level, Texas Education Agency Effective Schoolwork Framework provided guidance on high-quality instruction practices and leadership systems. And finally, TAPER data serve as the foundation for analyzing student performance trends at Donna High School. Together, the sources ensure that the improvement of the plan is both research-based and aligned with state expectations. Thank you again for this for allowing me to go ahead and do this presentation. My name is Jesse Garcia. It was a pleasure to go ahead and go over this with you. I hope that you have a wonderful day. And once more, thank you so very much. Good night.